The night air of the New Mexico high desert offered no relief. It was July, and the heat hadn't broken with the sun. It had only changed its nature, trading the sun's direct, searing glare for a thick, suffocating blanket that clung to the skin. Under the cold, indifferent light of a three-quarter moon, the land was a brutal canvas of silver and black, of rock and dust and skeletal flora. It was a land that promised nothing and took everything. And through it, she ran. Mara Delaney didn't know how long she had been running. Hours had bled into a single, continuous moment of agony. Time was measured not by the slow crawl of the moon across the star-pocked sky, but by the burning in her lungs and the screaming of the muscles in her legs. Her feet, stripped of their shoes somewhere back in the darkness, were a ruin of cuts and bruises. With every frantic step, sharp stones and thorns bit into the tender flesh. Each new pain a fresh insult added to the litany of suffering that was her flight. The fine, white dust of the alkali flats puffed up around her ankles, a ghostly mist that coated her skin and clogged her throat. She coughed, a dry, rasping sound that tore at her raw insides. But she didn't slow. To slow was to be caught. To be caught was a fate worse than any pain the desert could inflict upon her. Her dress, a simple calico that had been her Sunday best, was in tatters. The hem was shredded, catching on the grasping fingers of mesquite and creosote bushes that seemed to leap from the shadows. A long, cruel tear ran from her shoulder down to her waist, the fabric gaping open. But it was the back of the dress that told the truest story. It was stiff and dark with her own blood, stuck to the skin beneath. A series of deep, linear gashes welted her back, each one a throbbing line of fire. She could feel the warm, sticky trickle as one of them began to bleed anew. The sensation a grotesque counterpoint to the clammy sweat that soaked the rest of her body. She risked a glance over her shoulder. Nothing. Only the vast, empty expanse of the desert stretching back into an impenetrable darkness. But the absence of a visible threat was no comfort. She could still hear them. Or she thought she could. The sound was a phantom, a ghost in her ears, the distant, rhythmic thud of horses' hooves galloping over hard-packed earth. Sometimes it seemed to fade, lost in the pounding of her own heart, and a sliver of desperate hope would pierce through her terror. Maybe they had given up. Maybe they had lost her trail in the labyrinth of arroyos and canyons. Then the sound would return, carried on a gust of wind, seeming closer than before. A steady, relentless beat that was the sound of her own doom. They would not give up, not until they had what they came for. Her mind was a maelstrom of fractured images and sounds, a man's face, florid and cruel, looming in the lamplight, the reek of whiskey on his breath, the splintering crash as the door to her small room was kicked in, her mother's locket being ripped from her neck, and the searing, white-hot pain across her back as the riding crop fell. Once, twice. It wasn't about punishment. It was about breaking her. She had scrambled out the window, dropping into the alley behind the mercantile, the sound of their laughter chasing her into the night. That laughter was worse than the sound of the hooves. She stumbled, her ankle twisting violently on a loose rock. A sharp cry of pain escaped her lips, swallowed instantly by the immense silence of the desert. She fell hard, her hands and knees scraping against the gravelly soil. For a moment, she just stayed there, gasping, the world spinning in a dizzying whirl of silver and black. Tears of frustration and pain welled in her eyes, carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "Get up!" The voice in her head was faint, almost a whisper, but it was there. "Get up, Mara!" With a monumental effort, she pushed herself onto her hands and knees. Her body trembled with exhaustion. Every muscle fiber protested. It would be so easy to just lie here, to let the desert take her. It would be a cleaner end than the one her pursuers had planned. No. She forced herself back to her feet, swaying unsteadily. She took one step, then another. Her run was now a hobbling, lurching shamble, a pathetic imitation of her earlier flight. She was running on will alone, Her body had given up long ago. Before her, the ground fell away into a wide, shallow depression, a dry creek bed, its sandy bottom littered with smooth, pale stones that gleamed like bones in the moonlight, the promise of water. Now just a dusty memory. It represented everything this land was a beautiful lie, offering hope and delivering only desolation. It was a fitting place to die. She tried to scramble down the short, steep bank, but her legs refused to cooperate. They buckled completely, without warning. She didn't fall so much as collapse, tumbling down the embankment in a loose-limbed slide of dirt and rock, coming to rest at the bottom. She lay on her side, her cheek pressed against the cool, sandy earth. The grit was abrasive against her skin, but the coolness was a small, fleeting mercy. Her breath came in shallow, ragged pants. She tried to move, to crawl into the deeper shadows of the opposite bank, but her limbs were heavy, disconnected things that no longer belonged to her. There was no strength left, not a single drop. Her gaze drifted upwards, past the crumbling edge of the arroyo, to the sky. It was a terrifyingly beautiful sight. The stars were so bright, so numerous, they seemed to mock the singular, desperate struggle happening below. They had watched empires rise and fall, had seen generations of creatures live and die on this very patch of earth. Her own small, fleeting life was of no consequence to them. She was just another spark fading into the immense, eternal darkness. And then she heard it again. The sound of hoofbeats. This time, there was no mistaking it. It wasn't a phantom of her fear-addled mind. It was real. And it was closer. A steady, purposeful rhythm. They were not galloping now. They were trotting, conserving their mount's energy, confident in their pursuit. They knew she couldn't have gotten far. They knew she was broken. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to seize her, but she was too exhausted for it. The adrenaline was gone, burned away miles ago. All that remained was a profound, hollow terror. She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping to trace a path through the dust on her temple. This was it, the end of the chase. But her eyes wouldn't stay closed. They snapped open again, wide and unblinking, staring into the oppressive darkness of the far bank. They weren't the eyes of a fighter anymore, nor were they the eyes of one who had surrendered. They were the eyes of an animal caught in a trap, aware of the hunter's approach, able to do nothing but watch as its fate strides toward it. The world had shrunk to this single, terrifying point, the feeling of the rough earth beneath her, and the inexorable approaching sound that would soon bring it all to an end. The first hint of dawn was a faint, pearlescent gray that bled into the eastern sky, slowly diluting the impenetrable black of the night. It was the hour of stillness, when the nocturnal creatures of the desert had retreated to their burrows, and the world of the day had yet to stir. On the Thatcher Ranch, this was Cole's time. Cole Thatcher stood on the porch of the house his grandfather had built from river stone and ponderosa pine. At 42, he was a man shaped by the land he inhabited, solid, quiet, and weathered. His face was a roadmap of long days under a relentless sun, with the lines etched around his eyes from squinting into the distance and a jaw that seemed set against a perpetual wind. His hair, once the color of dark soil, was heavily frosted with silver at the temples, and his hands, wrapped around a steaming tin mug of coffee, were broad and calloused, capable of both immense strength and surprising gentleness. He had lived on this land his entire life. Save for a few years he didn't like to remember, the ranch was all that was left of his family. It was in his blood, in the marrow of his bones. He knew every dip and rise of the terrain, every stubborn patch of rock that refused a fence post, every cottonwood that offered a sliver of shade along the creek. His life was a cycle of predictable, solitary tasks, mending fences, breaking horses, moving his small herd of cattle to better pasture. The silence was his constant companion, and over the years, he had come to prefer it. It was a clean silence, honest and uncomplicated. He took a slow sip of his coffee, the bitter heat a familiar comfort. His gaze swept over the familiar landscape. The corrals stood empty and stark in the growing light. Beyond them, the high desert plains rolled away to meet a distant line of mesas that were just beginning to separate themselves from the sky. His eyes followed the long, straight line of his northern fence, a dark thread stitched across the pale land. And then he paused. Something was wrong. There was a dark shape crumpled against the fence line. About a quarter-mile out, it was small and indistinct, a heap of something that did not belong. It wasn't a dead coyote or a stray calf. The shape was wrong. It was too still. Cole's placid morning routine was broken by a sudden, sharp unease. He set his mug down on the porch railing with a quiet metallic click, his eyes never leaving the shape. He went back inside, pulled on his worn leather boots, and grabbed his hat. He didn't take a rifle. Whatever was out there, his gut told him it wasn't a threat. It was a victim. The walk was silent, save for the crunch of his boots on the dry, gravelly earth. The air was cool, but it held the promise of the day's coming heat. As he drew closer, the shape began to resolve itself. It was not an animal. It was a person, dressed in what looked like a tangle of rags, lying motionless. A woman. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over her. She was lying on her side, one arm flung out as if reaching for something, her face turned away from him. Her hair was a matted, tangled mess, full of dust and bits of dried leaves. Her dress, or what was left of it, was torn and stained, and even from this distance, he could see the dark, ugly patches of dried blood. Her feet were bare, swollen, and caked with a mixture of dirt and blood. Cole felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had seen violence before. He had seen its aftermath in the war and in the raw, often lawless settlements that dotted this territory. But to find it here, on the doorstep of his solitude, felt like a personal violation. He knelt, his movements slow and deliberate, not wanting to startle her if she was somehow still alive. "Mammy said," his voice low and raspy from disuse. There was no response. He reached out a hesitant hand and gently touched her shoulder. Her skin was cool, but not cold. He felt a faint, almost imperceptible tremor beneath his fingers. She was alive. A small puff of dust rose from her lips with a shallow, ragged breath. He carefully shifted his position to see her face. It was young, impossibly young, beneath the layers of grime and exhaustion. Her features were fine, delicate even, but drawn tight with pain and terror. Her lips were cracked and pale, even in unconsciousness. Her brow was furrowed, as if she were still running in some terrible dream. Cole made his decision in an instant. There was no question of leaving her here, no thought of riding into town for the sheriff. The town was a day's ride, and this woman didn't have a day. She needed water and care and safety. She needed sanctuary. His ranch, his fortress of solitude, would have to provide it. With a care that seemed at odds with his rugged frame, he slid one arm under her shoulders and the other beneath her knees. As he lifted her, a soft, pained moan escaped her lips. She was lighter than he could have imagined, a fragile, bird-like weight in his arms. It was an unsettling feeling. He was used to the solid, muscular weight of horses, the heft of saddles and feed sacks. This felt like holding something already broken, something that could be shattered completely with one wrong move. As he stood, his heart, a steady, reliable muscle that he rarely paid any mind, gave a strange, powerful thud against his ribs. It wasn't a feeling of romance or attraction. It was something older, more primal. It was the feeling of a man who had long since locked away a part of himself, only to have the door unexpectedly kicked open. He felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it almost staggered him. He held her a little tighter, adjusting her weight, and began the long walk back to the house. He carried her across the open ground, his steps measured and even, The sun was now cresting the mesas, casting long, stark shadows across the land and bathing the world in a soft, golden light. The beauty of the dawn was a jarring contrast to the grim reality of the woman in his arms. He looked down at her face, her head lolling against his shoulder. Who was she? What terror had sent her fleeing into the desert night? The questions were there, but they were for later. For now, there was only the task at hand. He carried her through the door of his simple, sturdy home. The interior was Spartan and clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. The furniture was handmade and functional, a solid table, 2 chairs, a bookshelf filled with worn volumes. In a small alcove, there was a simple cot, covered with a thick wool blanket. It was there he laid her down, his movements as gentle as if he were handling spun glass. She stirred as her body settled onto the cot, another low moan whispering from her lips. Her eyes fluttered but did not open. He went to the kitchen pump and filled a basin with cool, fresh water, grabbing a few clean cloths from a cupboard. He brought them back and set them on a small stool beside the cot. He had to see to her wounds, especially the ones on her back. He had to clean them before they festered. He gently propped her up on her side, her back facing him. The sight made his jaw clench. The torn fabric was matted to the skin with dried blood. The gashes were deep, angry red lines against the pale, dust-streaked skin. They were deliberate, cruel. This was not the work of thorns or rocks. This was the work of a man's hand. He dipped a cloth in the water, wrung it out, and reached toward her back. He had to soak the fabric to peel it away from the wounds. His touch was meant to be clinical, detached. But as his fingers, damp and cool, brushed against the edge of the torn cloth near her shoulder, her eyes flew open. They were wide, wild with a terror that went far beyond her physical pain. They weren't seeing him, Cole Thatcher, the man trying to help. They were seeing a ghost, a memory. Her body went rigid. She tried to flinch away, a movement so weak it was barely a twitch. Her voice, when it came, was a dry, broken whisper, a sound like dead leaves skittering across stone. "Wait," she breathed, the word barely audible. I take it off." Cole froze. His hand, which had known nothing but the heft of rope and the warmth of horsehide for years, felt like a brand. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. He had expected her to cry out in pain. He had not expected this. The words themselves were simple, but the meaning behind them was a chasm of horror. This wasn't modesty speaking. It wasn't pride. It was the desperate plea of a soul that could not bear to be touched. A terror so profound that even in her broken, half-conscious state, it was her primary, overriding instinct. He looked from the raw wounds on her back to the stark fear in her eyes. And in that moment, he understood. He understood that the men who had done this to her had taken far more than her safety. They had tried to take her very self. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. He stood up slowly, taking a step away from the cot to give her space, to show her. He was not a threat. He held up his empty hands, a gesture of peace. "All right," he said, his voice softer than he thought he was capable of. "All right." He watched as she struggled, with painstaking slowness, to work the tattered fabric away from her skin with trembling fingers, her face a mask of agony. He didn't offer to help again. He just stood there, a silent, solitary guardian in his own home, his heart hammering with a strange, forgotten ache. The clean, simple silence of his life had been shattered, and in its place was the complicated, terrible sound of a young woman's pain. He watched, a statue carved from stillness and regret, as she performed the slow, agonizing ritual of disrobing. Her movements were a study in pain. Each tiny shift of her body, each pull of fabric, made her gasp, her breath hissing through clenched teeth. The ruined calico, glued to her back by dried blood, was an enemy that had to be peeled away from her skin, millimeter by excruciating millimeter. Her fingers, slender and trembling, fumbled with the few remaining buttons at her collar. They were clumsy, disobedient things, shaking so violently she could barely guide them. Cole's own hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. The urge to help, to take over and end her suffering more quickly, was a physical force he had to fight to contain. But he remembered the look in her eyes, that raw, primal terror of a man's touch. To help would be to harm, and so he stood his ground, his presence a silent, unwilling witness. The only thing he could offer her was the dignity of her own struggle, however painful it was to watch. Finally, the last of the fabric was worked free. The dress sloughed off her shoulders and pooled at her waist. A wretched heap of rags. She was left in a thin, sweat-soaked chemise, the back of it bearing the same dark, terrible map of her injuries. She worked at it with the same pained slowness, her head bowed, her hair falling forward to hide her face. When at last she was free of it, she remained hunched over, shivering despite the growing warmth of the room, a fragile silhouette of misery. Only then did Cole move. He stepped forward quietly, picking up the basin of water. He dipped a fresh cloth into it, the sound of the water startlingly loud in the profound silence. He wrung it out until it was just damp and cool. "I have to clean these," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of necessity, spoken with a softness that stripped it of any command. She didn't answer, didn't even look at him, but she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the permission he needed. He knelt beside the cot. The clean, slightly metallic scent of the well water mingled with the coppery smell of blood and the dusty scent of the desert that clung to her. He started at the top, near her shoulder, where a long, angry welt disappeared into her tangled hair. He touched the cloth to her skin, his motion as light as a breath. She flinched violently. A full-body shudder and a choked sob broke from her throat, but she didn't pull away. "I know," he whispered, to her, to himself, to the ghosts in the room. "I know." His hands began their work, a slow, meticulous rhythm of touch and retreat. He would press the damp cloth to the edges of a wound, soaking the hardened blood, softening the ravaged skin. Then, with infinite patience, he would wipe away the grime, revealing the raw, damaged flesh beneath. Dip, wring, press, wipe. The motions became a kind of prayer, a penitence task. With every stain he cleansed from her skin, he felt as though he were trying to wipe away a stain on his own soul. The room was filled with the tiny sounds of his work and her pain, the slosh of water, the soft scrape of the cloth, her sharp, indrawn breaths that punctuated the silence like beats of a broken drum. She did not cry out again, but her whole body remained rigid, a bowstring pulled taut, vibrating with a silent scream. He saw how the wounds ran in parallel lines, evenly spaced. He saw the faint cross-hatching where the instrument of her torture, a whip or a crop, had fallen multiple times in the same place. This wasn't a frenzied, chaotic beating. This was methodical. It was calculated to inflict the maximum amount of pain while keeping the victim conscious. It was a cold, cruel artistry, and the sight of it stoked a slow, dangerous fire deep in his gut. As he worked his way down her back, cleaning the last and deepest of the gashes near the small of her back, his thumb brushed against the delicate curve of her spine. And in that moment, the room, the morning, the woman on the cot, it all fell away. The scent of water and blood was replaced by the acrid smell of wood smoke and burning pine. The quiet room dissolved into a cacophony of shouting, the splintering of wood, and the high, terrified neighing of horses. It was 1863. He was 16 years old. He was crouched in the dark, cramped space of the root cellar, his heart trying to hammer its way out of his chest. Through the rough-hewn floorboards above, he could see slivers of firelight dancing and hear the heavy, booted footsteps of strangers stomping through their home. They weren't soldiers, not from the Union or the Confederacy. They were something worse. They were stragglers, deserters, Men who had shed their uniforms and their humanity, who roamed the territories like a pack of wolves, taking what they wanted. He had his arm wrapped around his sister, Eleanor. She was 12, all sharp angles and bright, curious eyes. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his ribs. He had been given one job by his father before the man had run out with his rifle to join the other ranchers. Keep your sister safe, Cole, no matter what. Eleanor was shaking, her small hand clutching a little corn-husk doll. He could hear her whispering a prayer, the words lost in the chaos above. Then he heard his mother's voice, raised in defiance, followed by a sickening thud and a scream that was cut short. Cole squeezed his eyes shut, his arm tightening around Eleanor so hard she let out a little whimper. The footsteps were coming closer, directly overhead. A gruff voice laughed. "Check the cellar." The heavy wooden door was ripped open, flooding their hiding place with a terrifying, flickering light. A large, bearded face leered down at them. Cole stood up, trying to shield Eleanor with his own scrawny body. His hands balled into useless fists. "Well now, what have we here?" the man grinned, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. He remembered the hand that grabbed his shoulder, a grip of iron, and threw him aside as if he were a sack of grain. He remembered hitting the stone wall, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. He remembered struggling to his knees, gasping for air, and seeing them drag Eleanor out of the cellar. She was screaming his name. Cole, Cole. He saw the corn-husk doll lying forgotten in the dirt. He had failed. He had frozen. In the one moment his father had trusted him. In the one moment his sister had needed him. He had been nothing but a terrified boy. He never saw her alive again. Later, after the raiders had gone, after the fires had been put out, they found her in the barn. He remembered his father, a man he had never seen cry, sinking to his knees with a sound that wasn't human. Cole never forgot the sight of her blue-ribboned hair, dark with blood, tangled in the straw. It was an image burned onto the back of his eyes, a ghost that had walked with him every day for 29 years. His hand trembled. He was back in his cabin. The year was 1892. The woman on the cot was not his sister, but the vulnerability, the sheer, brutalized innocence. It was the same. The same ghosts were in this room. His touch, when he resumed his work, had changed. It was still gentle, but now it was freighted with the weight of that memory, with the heavy burden of his failure. He finished cleaning the last of the wounds, his movements now almost reverent. He rose and went to a small, carved wooden chest at the foot of his own bed. He opened it, the scent of cedar and dried herbs filling the air. Inside, among a few folded letters and his father's old pocket watch, was a small ceramic pot. It contained a dark, pungent salve of comfrey and yarrow, a recipe his mother had used for everything from rope burns to horse bites. He brought it back to the cot and, using the tips of his fingers, began to gently apply the cool, soothing ointment to her wounds. He covered each gash with a thin, protective layer. Then, he took a clean linen sheet from the chest and tore it into long, wide strips. With the practiced hands of a man used to bandaging horses' legs, he carefully dressed her back, wrapping the strips around her torso to hold them in place. His work was neat, efficient, and impersonal. He was building a wall between her and the world, a fragile barricade of cloth and ointment. When he was finished, he gently pulled a light wool blanket up to her shoulders. He stepped back, his work done. The immediate danger of infection was lessened. Now, all that was left was the deeper healing, the kind he couldn't help with. He filled a dipper with fresh water from the bucket by the door and brought it to her. He knelt again, holding it to her lips. "Drink," he said softly. Her eyes, which had been closed, fluttered open. They were clearer now, the initial shock replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. She looked at the dipper, then at him. He saw a flicker of the old fear, but it was overshadowed by a desperate thirst. She pushed herself up slightly on one elbow, wincing, and drank. She drank greedily, the cool water spilling from the corners of her mouth and down her chin. When she was done, she fell back against the cot, her breath coming a little easier. They sat in silence for a long moment. The morning sun was now streaming through the single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He could hear the low nicker of a horse from the corral. It was a normal sound, from a normal morning. But nothing felt normal anymore. He knew he had to ask. He had to know who this specter of violence was. "What's your name?" he asked. She stared at the rough-hewn wooden ceiling, her gaze fixed on something he couldn't see. Her throat worked for a moment before the words came, a voice so quiet it was little more than a rustle of dry leaves. "Mara," she whispered. "Mara Delaney." And that was all. She offered nothing more. No story, no explanation, no pleas for help. Just her name. A single, solitary piece of her identity she had managed to carry out of the darkness. Cole nodded slowly. He didn't need any more. He didn't need the words. The way she still trembled under the blanket. The haunted, far-off look in her eyes. The way she had recoiled from him, that was the story. It was a tale told in the language of terror, a language he unfortunately understood. To ask for more would be a cruelty, another violation. He stood up, took the empty dipper, and placed it back in the bucket. He looked down at her one last time. Her eyes were closed again, her face pale and still against the dark wool of the blanket. She was a castaway washed up on the shores of his solitude, and like it or not, her storm was now his. Mara awoke to a world of muted light and profound stillness. For a long, disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling above her was made of thick, hand-hewn wooden beams, dark with age and smoke. The air smelled of wood ash, old leather, and something else. Something clean and savory like brewing coffee. She was lying on a narrow cot, tucked under a heavy wool blanket that felt rough but wonderfully warm against her skin. Memory returned not as a gentle stream, but as a violent flood. The running, the darkness, the sound of hooves, the searing pain in her back. Her eyes flew open, and she tried to sit up, a gasp of fear and pain catching in her throat. Her body screamed in protest. Every muscle was a knot of agony, and the wounds on her back sent a fresh wave of fire across her skin. "Easy now." The voice was low and calm, coming from across the small room. She turned her head, her movements stiff and slow. The man from the desert was sitting at a simple wooden table, a tin mug cradled in his hands. He hadn't moved toward her. He simply sat there, watching, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He was older than she had realized, with threads of silver in his dark hair and a face that looked as if it had been carved from the same rugged landscape that surrounded them. She sank back onto the cot, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was weak, trapped, but as she looked at him, she saw no threat in his eyes. She saw only a deep, quiet watchfulness, the same quality she'd seen in a hawk circling high above the plains patient, observant and utterly self-contained. She remembered his gentleness, the slow, careful way he had tended to her. She remembered his hands pulling back the moment she had flinched. "You're safe here," he said, as if reading her thoughts. He took a sip from his mug. "There's broth on the stove when you feel up to it." He didn't ask her name again. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply stated a fact and made an offer, leaving the vast, silent space between them for her to fill as she saw fit. It was a kindness more profound than any she had known. In a world where men took, this man gave. He gave her space. He gave her silence. He gave her the choice to speak or not. She lay there for a long time, listening to the quiet sounds of the cabin, the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth, the rhythmic tick of a simple clock on the mantel, the man steady, even breathing. Outside, the world was waking up. A rooster crowed, its call thin and distant. The sun, climbing higher, cast a bright rectangle of light on the wooden floor. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, She did not feel hunted. The terror that had been her constant companion was still there, a coiled serpent in the pit of her stomach. But for now, it was sleeping. The safety of this small, quiet room gave her a strange sort of courage. The story she carried was a toxic burden, a poison that had been eating away at her from the inside. To keep it locked away was to let it fester. To speak it aloud was a terrifying prospect, but perhaps it was the only way to draw the poison out. She pushed herself up slowly, this time ignoring the protests of her body. She managed to swing her legs over the side of the cot, her bare feet finding the cool, smooth planks of the floor. The blanket was wrapped around her shoulders like a cloak. The man, Cole, did not move, but his eyes followed her. "The men who did this," she began, her voice a dry, scratchy whisper. She had to stop and swallow, her throat feeling as if it were coated in dust. "They won't stop looking for me." Cole set his mug down on the table. "What's his name?" he asked. He hadn't asked who they were. He had asked who he was. He knew, instinctively, that a pack of wolves always had an alpha. The name felt like a stone in her throat. To speak it was to give the monster a form, to summon it into this safe, quiet space. She took a shuddering breath. Silas Durbin. She watched for a reaction, and she saw one, a subtle, almost imperceptible tightening of the muscles around his jaw. He knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. "He owns the bank in Redemption," she continued, the words coming a little easier now that the first, hardest one had been spoken. "But he owns more than that. He owns the sheriff. He owns most of the ranches, or at least the debt on them. He sits on the town council, the church board. He owns the town. People smile at him on the street, tip their hats. They're all terrified of him. They call him the Undertaker, because when he buys your debt, he's just waiting to bury you." She paused, remembering. Her voice grew smaller. "My mother, she did laundry, mending, for years. We had a small house, but the deed was held by the bank. She was sick for a long time, the consumption, but she kept working right up until the end, trying to keep us clear of Mr. Durbin's ledger." She looked down at her hands, twisting a corner of the wool blanket. "When she passed 2 months ago, Mr. Durbin paid a call. He brought a sympathy basket. He was all soft words and sad eyes. He said he knew my mother had left a considerable debt. He said that a young woman, alone in the world, needed protection." The word came out laced with a venom that surprised even her. "He offered to cancel the debt. He would let me keep the house. He would see to it I was taken care of. All I had to do was accept his guardianship, move into his big house on the hill, be his ward." She looked up, her eyes meeting Cole's across the room. She wanted him to understand. "He's old enough to be my grandfather. Everyone knows what he is, what he does to the girls who work in his house. It wasn't an offer. It was a bill of sale. He was buying me." "I told him no," she said, her voice regaining a sliver of its strength. "I told him I would work and pay the debt myself. I thanked him for his concern, and I showed him the door. You should have seen his face. The smile never left his eyes, but it turned into something else, something cold and dead. He told me I was a foolish girl. He said I would learn that in his town. No one told him no." She had to stop. Her breath catching in a sob she refused to let escape. Cole remained perfectly still, his silence an invitation to continue. "He gave me a week. Last night was the end of the week. His men came. Not him, of course. He never gets his own hands dirty. It was Peters and the younger Calloway boy. They work for him. They do his collecting. They kicked the door in. They said Mr. Durbin had sent them to collect what was owed. It wasn't about the money. It was about the lesson he'd promised to teach me." She instinctively pulled the blanket tighter, as if it could ward off the memory. "They took my mother's locket, and then—" Peters unhooked the riding crop he carries on his belt. "He said Mr. Durbin wanted me to be persuaded, to be more agreeable. I fought. I threw the oil lamp at them. It caught the curtains, while they were trying to put out the fire. I scrambled out the back window and I ran. I ran until I couldn't run anymore." She finished, her story hanging in the quiet air of the cabin, ugly and undeniable. The telling had exhausted her completely. She sat hunched on the edge of the cot, trembling, waiting for his judgment, waiting for him to tell her it was too much trouble, that he couldn't get involved, waiting for him to cast her back out into the desert. Cole didn't move for a full minute. He just looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the quiet sympathy she had seen before. But then, something else began to happen. It was a slow, terrifying transformation. The sympathy did not vanish, but it was eclipsed by something harder, colder. It was like watching a calm lake freeze over in an instant. The deep, quiet brown of his eyes seemed to darken, the light in them hardening into something sharp and dangerous. The lines around his mouth, which had been softened by concern, drew into a thin, hard line. His right hand, which had been resting on the table, slowly, almost unconsciously, curled into a fist. The knuckles went white. It was the only part of him that moved, but the motion was more eloquent than any shout of rage. It was the gesture of a man who had come to a final, irrevocable conclusion. The memory of his sister, Eleanor, her blue ribbon tangled in the bloody straw, rose in his mind, as clear and sharp as if it had happened yesterday. He saw the leering face of the raider in the cellar door. He saw the same predatory entitlement, the same casual cruelty that assumed the world and everyone in it was theirs for the taking. Silas Durbin and that long-dead raider were cut from the same rotten cloth. They were men who fed on the fear of the vulnerable. They were men who broke things just to watch them shatter. For nearly 30 years, Cole had lived with the ghost of his failure. He had built a wall of solitude around himself, tending his horses and his land, convinced that the part of him that could fight, that could protect, had died with his sister in that barn. But now, listening to Mara's quiet, broken voice, he felt that long-dormant part of him stir. It woke not with a roar, but with a cold, clear, and absolute fury. He finally rose from the table. His movements were deliberate, imbued with a new, grim purpose. He walked to the hearth, picked up the iron poker, and stoked the embers of the fire, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up the chimney. He didn't look at Mara, but he spoke to her, his voice low and steady, but underscored with a new edge of tempered steel. "You'll have that broth now," he said. "It wasn't a suggestion. You need to get your strength back." He turned and looked at her, and the cold anger in his eyes was so potent it made her catch her breath. "Silas Durbin and his men," he said, the name sounding like a curse on his lips. "They will not find you here. This is my land, and on my land, I am the only Lohi that matters." 2 days passed in a state of suspended animation. The world of the Thatcher Ranch, once governed by the steady, predictable rhythms of sun and season, was now ruled by a new, unspoken law, the law of waiting. It was a tense, fragile existence, lived in the long shadow of a threat that had yet to fully materialize. Mara healed in increments so small they were almost imperceptible. The fire of her wounds banked to a dull, throbbing ache. She graduated from the cot to sitting in one of the chairs by the table, and then to taking slow, painful steps across the cabin floor. Her limp was pronounced, and her back was a landscape of pain that dictated her every move. But with each passing hour, a little more strength returned to her limbs. She was quiet, speaking only when necessary, but her silence was no longer that of a terrified victim. It was the watchful, observant silence of a survivor. She insisted on helping, taking over the small tasks of keeping the fire fed and the coffee pot full. Her movements slow and deliberate. It was a way of reclaiming some small piece of herself, of asserting that she was more than just the pain that had been inflicted upon her. Cole watched her, saying little. He provided broth, fresh water, and more of his mother's salve. He moved about his home with a quiet purpose, his presence a steady, reassuring constant. But a profound change had come over him. The easy, solitary peace of his life was gone, replaced by a vigilant tension. He was a man bracing for a storm he knew was coming. He spent an entire afternoon on the porch, methodically stripping down his Winchester rifle. He cleaned every part with an oiled rag until the metal gleamed, his calloused fingers moving with an expert familiarity. He inspected each cartridge before loading it back into the magazine, his actions precise and unhurried. He was not a man who enjoyed violence, but he was a man who understood its necessity. He was preparing not for a fight he wanted, but for a fight he knew he could not avoid. His senses were on a knife's edge, every gust of wind whistling through the eaves, every distant cry of a hawk, every shift of his horses in the corral made him pause, his head lifting, his eyes scanning the vast, empty horizon. He was listening for the one sound that mattered, the sound of approaching hooves. It came on the morning of the third day. The sun was hot, beating down from a flawless, pale blue sky. Mara was standing by the open cabin door, breathing in the dry, sage-scented air, when Cole, who was replacing a worn strap on a saddle by the barn, suddenly went still. His head came up, his gaze fixed on a point far to the east, along the dusty track that passed for a road to the town of Redemption. Mara saw nothing at first. Then she spotted it, a faint, rising plume of dust, little more than a smudge against the distant mesas. It was not the lazy, drifting dust of a whirlwind. It was focused, directional, and it was coming their way. "Inside," Cole said. His voice was perfectly level, devoid of any alarm, but it carried an authority that was absolute. "Get inside and stay away from the window." He didn't run. He placed his leather-working tools neatly on a crate, wiped his hands on his trousers, and walked with long, measured strides to the house. He took his Winchester from the pegs where it rested by the door and moved to stand on the porch, a solid, unmoving figure in the center of the vast, sun-drenched landscape. Mara retreated into the shadows of the cabin, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. She watched through a small gap in the curtains as the dust cloud grew, resolving itself into the shapes of 4 riders. They moved at a steady trot, their arrogance visible even from a distance. They rode as if the entire territory belonged to them, their posture relaxed, their rifles holstered. This was not a posse enforcing the law. This was a collection agency coming to claim property. As they drew near the fence line, she recognized the man in the lead. It was Peters, his heavy-set frame slouched in the saddle, his face shadowed by the brim of a dusty black hat. Beside him rode the Calloway boy, barely a man, trying to imitate the older man's swagger. They slowed their horses to a walk, their approach now a deliberate, insolent crawl. They stopped just outside the main gate to the ranch yard, surveying the simple stone house, the neat corrals, and the lone figure standing on the porch. Cole did not move. He stood with his weight evenly balanced, the Winchester held loosely in the crook of his left arm, its barrel pointed at the wooden planks of the porch. It was a pose of casual readiness, far more menacing than if he had aimed it directly at them. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the stamping of the horses' hooves, the creak of saddle leather, and the low, constant whisper of the wind. Finally, Peter spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Thatcher!" he called out, his voice carrying a note of condescending familiarity. "We ain't got no quarrel with you." Cole remained silent, his eyes narrowed against the sun's glare, fixed on the man. Peters shifted in his saddle, clearly unnerved by the lack of response. "We're looking for something," he continued. "Property of Mr. Durbin. A girl, name of Delaney, stole a few things and lit out. We tracked her this way." The lie was so blatant, so audacious, it almost made Mara gasp. They were painting her as the criminal, building the foundation for whatever they planned to do next. Cole's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, yet it carried across the yard with perfect clarity. "Is that a fact?" The simple question seemed to hang in the air, heavy with skepticism. Peters's face darkened. It is. Now, we got reason to believe she's holed up on your land. We're gonna need to take a look inside that house. He made a motion as if to swing down from his horse. This is private property, Cole said. The words were not loud, but they stopped Peters cold. His hand froze on the saddle horn. Now see here, Thatcher, Peters blustered, his voice rising. We're on official business for Mr. Durbin. You ain't got the right to refuse. I've got every right, Cole replied, his voice still unnervingly calm. He shifted his weight slightly, and the Winchester in his arm moved with him, its polished barrel catching a glint of sunlight. This land has been in my family for 60 years. The law says I've got the right to deny entry to any man who comes without a warrant signed by a judge. You got a warrant. Peters. Peters stared at him, his mouth a thin line. The Calloway boy looked nervously from Peters to Cole and back again. The other two men remained silent, their hands resting near the butts of their pistols. We don't need no damn warrant, Peters snarled. This is Durbin's county. Maybe so, Cole said, his gaze as steady and hard as granite. But this is my ranch. He took a half step forward, to the edge of the porch. I'm going to tell you this once. The only people who cross my fence line without an invitation are those who are tired of living, and I don't recall inviting any of you. The threat was unmistakable. It was laid bare in the middle of the yard, as stark and dangerous as a coiled rattlesnake. There was no anger in Cole's voice, no bluster. There was only a simple, lethal statement of fact. It was the voice of a man who had drawn a line in the dust, a line he was fully prepared to die on, and to kill for. Peters held Cole's gaze, and for the first time a flicker of uncertainty, of something that looked like fear, crossed his face. He was a bully and a thug, used to preying on the weak and the frightened. He had come expecting to find a scared girl and maybe an old, solitary rancher who could be easily intimidated. He had not expected this. He had not expected to be staring down the barrel of a man's conviction. And he did not like what he saw in Cole Thatcher's eyes. He saw a man who had nothing left to lose and who had already made his peace with whatever was to come. To push this man now would mean a gunfight, and Peters, for all his swagger, was not sure he would walk away from it. He gathered his reins, his posture stiff with frustrated rage. You're making a powerful mistake. Thatcher, he spat. A powerful mistake. Mr. Durbin will hear about this. He ain't gonna forget it. I'm not asking him to, Cole said softly, with a final, venomous glare. Peters yanked his horse's head around and spurred it back toward the road. The other three, looking visibly relieved, quickly followed suit. They rode away without a backward glance. Their retreat, as ignominious as their arrival, had been arrogant. Cole did not move. He stood on the porch, the rifle still in his arm, and watched until they were nothing more than a fading cloud of dust on the horizon. The silence they left behind was heavier, more ominous than the silence that had preceded them. The immediate danger had passed, but the air was thick with the promise of its return. He finally lowered the rifle and turned, his shoulders slumping slightly, as if he had been holding up a great weight. He walked back into the cabin. Mara was standing in the middle of the room, her back to the wall. In her hand, she clutched a heavy iron skillet, holding it like a club. Her face was pale, but her eyes were blazing with a defiant fire. She had been ready to fight. Their eyes met across the shadowy space. No words were exchanged. None were needed. In the crucible of that brief, tense confrontation, something had been forged between them. The fragile relationship of rescuer and victim was gone. They were allies now, bound together in a conflict that had just begun. The ranch was no longer just his sanctuary. It was their fortress, and they both knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the stone of the cabin walls, that the enemy would be back. The departure of Durbin's men did not bring peace. Instead, it left behind a ringing silence, a void that was quickly filled by a heightened, nerve-shredding tension. The ranch, once a haven of solitude, now felt like a small, exposed island in the middle of a vast, hostile ocean. Every shadow seemed longer. Every gust of wind sounded like the whisper of a threat. The world outside Cole's fence line had become enemy territory. The day passed in a series of quiet, purposeful actions. Cole did not speak of the confrontation, and neither did Mara. There was no need. The event was a living thing between them, a shared experience that had irrevocably altered their strange, silent partnership. He moved with a grim efficiency, his focus turned outward, toward defense. He spent an hour walking the perimeter of his small homestead, not checking the fences for cattle, but for vulnerabilities. He noted the shallow dip in the land to the south that could hide an approaching rider, the clear line of sight from the barn's hayloft to the front gate. His mind, long occupied with the simple calculus of seasons and livestock, was now engaged in a different, darker arithmetic, the mathematics of survival. Mara watched him from the cabin. She saw him clean and oil a second weapon, a heavy Colt revolver, its metal dark and deadly. She saw him stack firewood by the front and back doors, not just for warmth, but as potential barricades. Each action was a silent testament to the danger she had brought upon him, a fresh entry in a debt she felt she could never repay. Her guilt was a physical weight, a constant ache that sat alongside the healing wounds on her back. He had stood between her and Durban's men. He had faced them down for her, a stranger. He had drawn a line in the dust and placed his own life on it. She could not, would not, allow him to be the sole guardian of a battle that was hers. As dusk fell, it brought with it a fragile truce. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant, bloody strokes of orange and crimson, a beautiful, violent spectacle that seemed to mirror the turmoil in their lives. Inside the cabin, the flickering light of the kerosene lamp and the warm glow of the fire pushed back the encroaching darkness, creating an illusion of safety. Cole had prepared a simple meal of beans and jerky, and they ate in their now customary silence. But the silence had changed. Before, it had been the comfortable quiet of a solitary man, and later, the cautious quiet of two strangers. Now, it was the charged, communicative silence of allies facing a common enemy. Every shared glance, every small gesture, was freighted with unspoken meaning. After the meal, he poured 2 mugs of strong, black coffee. He handed one to her and sat in his usual chair by the hearth. Mara took the mug, the warmth seeping into her cold hands, and sat on a small stool opposite him. The fire crackled and hissed, a lively, domestic sound in the heart of the tense quiet. The shadows danced on the rough-hewn walls, making the small room seem both intimate and immense. She stared into the flames, watching the wood crumble into glowing embers. She had been given a reprieve, a temporary shelter from the storm. But it was his storm now, too. Her fear had become his burden. Her fight had become his risk. She could not let that stand. To remain here, a passive, protected thing while he stood guard, was another kind of violation, a theft of his peace, his safety. It was a slower, quieter version of what Silas Durban and his men did, taking from others to serve oneself. She finally looked up from the fire and met his gaze. His face, illuminated by the flickering light, was calm, his expression revealing nothing, but she saw the watchfulness in his eyes, the subtle tension in the set of his shoulders. He was a man at war, whether he would admit it or not. "I can't live like this," she said, her voice low but clear, cutting through the quiet. "Hiding, waiting, letting you stand between me and them. It isn't right." Cole looked at her, his expression unchanged. He took a slow sip of his coffee before answering, "They know you're here now. There's nowhere else for you to run. Hiding is all that's left." For how long, she challenged, a new, desperate energy rising in her. "Until they come back with more men, until they decide to burn this place to the ground with both of us in it. I ran from them once, and it only led the wolves to your door. I won't do it again. I can't just be the girl you have to protect." A long, heavy silence settled between them. broken only by the pop of a resin pocket in the fire. Cole stared into the flames, his gaze distant, as if he were looking back across a great many years. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, dredged up from a place of old, carefully buried pain. "I used to hide, too," he said, not looking at her, "for a long time. Not in a cabin, but right out in the open. I hid behind my fences, my horses, this ranch. Hid from anything that wasn't the sun coming up and the sun going down. You build your walls high enough, you can convince yourself you're safe." He finally turned his head, his eyes finding hers in the firelight. They held a profound, ancient weariness. "But you're just in a prison of your own making. And you're right, I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of running from ghosts." The admission was a key turning a lock deep inside Mara. He wasn't just a stoic, kind stranger. He was a man who understood the prison of fear. His confession was a gift, a bridge built between his solitude and hers. It gave her the final ounce of courage she needed. "Then we have to stop them?" she said, her voice gaining intensity. "Not just for me, for you, for everyone in that town. They're bleeding dry. We can't just wait for them to come. We have to fight back." A flicker of something pity, perhaps, or grim amusement crossed his face. "Fight back, girl. You saw them. That was just Peters and his boys. Durbin has a dozen men like that on his payroll. He owns the law. Fighting him is like trying to fight the sunrise. It's coming, whether you like it or not." "No," she said, leaning forward, her eyes bright with a feverish light. "You're wrong. You think I'm just some laundress's daughter he decided to torment. But I'm more than that. I'm the woman who served him his coffee every morning for the last 6 months." Cole went very still, his mug halfway to his lips. "What are you saying?" "My mother," Mara explained, the words tumbling out now. A torrent held back for too long. She saved every spare penny she ever made, not for a new dress or for a doctor. For me, for books. She wanted me to have more than a life of scrubbing other people's clothes. I can read and write, and I'm good with numbers. After she died, Mara continued, and after I refused his offer of guardianship, he changed his tactic. He must have thought it was a better way to control me. He offered me a position, a clerk at the bank. He said it was a way to work off my mother's debt. He thought he was being clever. He wanted me there, under his roof, under his thumb, where he could watch me all day. He thought he was putting me in a cage. She gave a small, bitter smile. But he wasn't. He was giving me a key. Cole slowly lowered his mug to the table. His eyes narrowed, his focus absolute. He was no longer looking at a frightened girl. He was looking at something else entirely. "Durbin is a careful man," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But he's arrogant. He believes everyone is either too stupid or too scared to ever challenge him. He keeps 2 sets of books. One is for the public, for the territorial bank examiners. It's clean, perfect. It shows fair loans and honest dealings." She leaned in closer, the firelight dancing in her wide, intense eyes. "But there's another one, a second ledger. It's where he keeps the real accounts, the threats, the blackmail, the impossible interest rates that have bled ranchers out of their land. It shows how he bought the sheriff, how he paid men like Peters to burn out homesteaders who wouldn't sell. It's all in there. Cole, every crime, every name, every date, it's the source of his power. It's the story of how he built his kingdom on the ruins of other people's lives, and I know where he keeps it." The cabin was utterly silent. The fire seemed to hold its breath. Cole stared at her, his mind racing, processing the implications of her words. This changed everything. This was not a fight of fists and guns anymore. It was a fight of ink and paper, a fight they could actually win. Where he asked, his voice a low, urgent rasp. "In his office at the bank," she answered, "behind the big gaudy portrait of his father that hangs on the wall. It's not a portrait, it's a door. It opens into a shallow wall safe, built right into the stone. That's where he keeps it. I saw him put it there myself. late one night when he thought I had already gone home." She sank back onto the stool, the confession leaving her breathless but strangely lightened. She had given him the truth. She had given him a weapon. She had placed her life and his on this single, desperate gamble. Cole did not speak for a long time. He rose from his chair and walked to the fireplace. Resting one hand on the rough stone of the mantel, he stared down into the flames, his back to her. The firelight played across the hard lines of his face, revealing a mind at work, a strategist weighing the odds, calculating the risks. The quiet rancher was gone. In his place was a man forged in the fires of an older, bigger war, a man who understood strategy and sacrifice. He had spent decades hiding from the man he used to be. Now, a girl with haunted eyes and a dangerous secret was asking that man to come back. And as he stood there, feeling the weight of her revelation settle upon him, he knew, with a grim and final certainty, that his time of hiding was well and truly over. The ghosts of the past had finally caught up to him, and they were demanding a reckoning. The plan, born of desperation and whispered in the flickering firelight of the cabin, was as simple as it was mad. It relied on three things: the cover of darkness, Mara's intimate knowledge of the bank, and a fury that had finally burned away their fear. But as the third night fell, nature itself offered them a fourth, and more powerful, ally. The storm began as a distant, menacing rumble in the west, a low growl from the belly of the mountains. By nightfall, the sky was a bruised, roiling canvas of purple and black, and the wind had begun to moan through the pinon pines, a low, mournful sound that set the teeth on edge. Cole and Mara worked in near silence, their movements economical and grim. He saddled the two horses he had chosen, his own steady gelding and a nimble mare for her, their coats already damp from the thick, heavy air. He handed Mara a heavy oilskin slicker that smelled of wax and rain. It was far too large for her, but it would keep the worst of the weather out. "Are you sure about this?" he asked one last time, his voice a low rumble beneath the rising wind. He wasn't questioning her courage, but offering her a final chance to turn back from a path that held no guarantees. She looked up at him, her face pale in the gloom of the barn, her eyes reflecting the nervous flicker of the lantern. Her shoulders were set in a line of grim resolve. "I'm sure," she said, her voice steady. "He can't be allowed to win. Not anymore." There was nothing left to say. He helped her into the saddle, his hands briefly closing over hers on the reins. It was a simple, practical gesture, but it felt like a pact, a silent acknowledgement of the terrible risk they were about to share. They rode out not as fugitives, but as hunters, their heads bowed against a wind that was now beginning to shriek. The first drops of rain, cold and heavy as lead pellets, began to fall. By the time they were halfway to the town of Redemption, the storm had broken in its full, biblical fury. Lightning tore the sky in jagged, incandescent scars, followed by shattering claps of thunder that vibrated through the very ground beneath the horses' hooves. In the brief, blinding flashes of light, the world was a stark, terrifying landscape of twisted trees and skeletal rocks. Then it would be plunged back into a blackness so profound it was like being submerged in ink. The rain hammered down, a solid, blinding curtain of water that turned the dusty track into a slick, treacherous river of mud. It was a miserable, punishing ride. But the storm was their shield. Its roar would drown out the sound of their approach. Its darkness would hide them from any watchful eyes, and its violence seemed to mirror the maelstrom in their own hearts. They didn't ride into the main street of Redemption. Instead, Cole led them on a wide, circling path, coming in from the north. Through a tangle of alleys and back lots he seemed to know from some forgotten chapter of his life. They dismounted in the narrow, muddy lane behind the mercantile, tying their horses to a hitching rail where they stood shivering, their heads drooping in the downpour. The bank stood before them, a squat, two-story stone building that looked more like a fortress than a place of business. Its windows were dark, its facade slick and gleaming in the intermittent flashes of lightning. It was a monument to Silas Durbin's power. Solid, impenetrable, and cold. "The back office," Mara whispered, her voice nearly lost in a sudden gust of wind that rattled the loose shutters on the building opposite. "There's a window. It's high, but the latch is old. Sometimes it doesn't catch." Cole nodded, pulling a small, heavy pry bar from his saddle roll. He moved with a predator's grace, hugging the rough stone wall of the bank, the rain plastering his hair to his scalp. Mara followed, her heart a frantic bird in her chest, the oilskin slicker tangling around her legs. The window was exactly where she'd said. It was dark and forbidding, a small square of blackness set high in the wall. Cole tested it first, pushing against the frame. It was locked fast. He didn't hesitate. He wedged the tip of the pry bar into the narrow gap between the sash and the frame. He put his shoulder into it, his muscles bunching under his wet shirt. For a moment, there was only the groaning of stressed wood and the drumming of the rain. Then, with a sharp crack that sounded as loud as a gunshot in Mara's ears, the latch gave way. The window swung inward with a low, protesting squeak. Cole looked at her. "Give me your hands." He clasped her wrists and, with an ease that belied his age, lifted her off the ground. She scrambled for purchase on the wet stone, her fingers finding the sill. She pulled herself through the narrow opening, tumbling onto the floor inside with a soft thud. The air in the office was stale and cold, smelling of oiled metal, paper, and the faint, cloying scent of Silas Durbin's cigars. A moment later, Cole followed, swinging himself through the window with a surprising agility. He landed silently beside her, a dark, dripping shape in the near-total blackness. For a moment, they just stood there, listening. There was only the sound of the storm raging outside and the frantic, syncopated rhythm of their own breathing. "Stay here," Cole whispered, his voice a breath of sound by her ear. "I'll check the lobby." He melted into the darkness, his revolver now in his hand. Mara was left alone in the heart of her fear. This was the room where she had served Durbin his coffee, where she had endured his leering smiles and veiled threats. It was a cage, and she had willingly walked back into it. She could feel the ghost of his presence here, a cold, oppressive weight in the air. Cole returned a few moments later, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the doorway. "It's clear," he said. "Just the night watchman. He's asleep in a chair by the front door. The storm is covering us. Let's do this." They moved together into Durbin's main office, a room that reeked of wealth and arrogance. A massive mahogany desk dominated the space, and the walls were lined with leather-bound books that Mara knew for a fact had never been opened. And on the far wall, illuminated by a sudden, brilliant flash of lightning, was the portrait. It was a large, ostentatious painting of a pompous, glowering man with a face like a clenched fist, Silas Durbin's father. In the strobing, unnatural light, the man's eyes seemed to follow them, dead and empty and full of judgment. Mara went to it without hesitation. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a layer of pure, focused rage. Her fingers, though trembling, moved with purpose along the ornate, gilded frame. "Here," she whispered, her fingers finding a small, almost invisible indentation in the carved woodwork. She pressed. There was a soft, well-oiled click. The entire portrait swung away from the wall, revealing a dark, square opening. Inside, glinting dully in the faint light from the window, was a heavy iron safe, and sitting on top of it was the book. It was a thick, heavy ledger, bound in dark green leather, its corners reinforced with brass. It looked utterly ordinary, mundane, but Mara knew it was the black heart of Silas Durbin's empire. Cole reached in and took it. The book had a physical weight, a heft that seemed appropriate for the human misery it contained. He handed it to Mara. Her fingers closed around the worn leather. It felt cold, almost alive. She opened it. Even in the dim, erratic light. She could make out the familiar, spidery script of Durbin's hand. She flipped through the pages, her breath catching in her throat. It was all there, a meticulous, damning catalog of human misery. Names she recognized: widows who had lost their homes, ranchers cheated out of their water rights, homesteaders whose land had been acquired through threats and intimidation. She saw records of payments to the sheriff, to Peters, to a dozen other men. She saw a list of names of native families who had been driven from their ancestral lands with forged documents. And then, near the back, she saw it, her mother's name, Abigail Delaney. Beside it was a notation, a sum of money far greater than what she had actually owed, and a single, chilling word: leverage. A tear of pure, hot rage slid down her cheek. She snapped the book shut. "We have it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We have it all." "Then let's go," Cole urged, already moving toward the door. But it was too late. A sliver of yellow light suddenly appeared under the main office door. Slicing through the darkness, a floorboard creaked in the outer lobby. The sound was soft, but in the charged silence of the bank, it was as loud as a thunderclap. Cole reacted instantly. He grabbed Mara's arm and pulled her back, away from the door, flattening them both against the far wall, deep in the shadows. He raised his revolver, his body a tense, coiled spring. The office door swung open slowly, its hinges groaning. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, holding a kerosene lantern high. The light cast long, dancing shadows that turned the familiar office into a landscape of monsters. And behind the man, another figure stepped into the light. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his silver hair neatly combed. He held a small, silver-plated derringer in one hand. It was Silas Durbin. He took in the scene with a glance: the open window, the swinging portrait, the empty space where his ledger should have been. His eyes, cold and gray as a winter sky, finally settled on the shadows where Cole and Mara were hiding. A slow, cruel smile spread across his thin lips. "Well, well," Durbin said, his voice a soft, cultured purr that was more terrifying than any shout. "I thought I heard rats in my vault. I see you brought one of my little clerks with you. Thatcher, I suppose I should thank you for returning my property." The man with the lantern stepped aside, and Peters filled the doorway, a sneering grin on his face and a large Colt revolver in his hand. They were trapped. "Give me the book, Thatcher," Durbin said calmly. "Give me the book and the girl, and I might just let you walk out of here." Cole didn't answer. He could feel Mara trembling beside him, clutching the heavy ledger to her chest as if it were a shield. He knew Durbin's promise was a lie. There was no walking away from this. No, a pity. Durbin sighed. Peters. It all happened in a fraction of a second. Peters raised his Colt. Cole fired first. The roar of his revolver in the enclosed space was deafening, a physical blow to the eardrums. The cabin filled with a thick, acrid cloud of gun smoke. Peters staggered back, a look of shocked surprise on his face, his own shot going wild and splintering the wood of the desk. Cole didn't wait to see the result. He shoved Mara down behind the desk. "Stay down," he yelled, his voice raw. Another shot rang out, this one from Durbin's derringer. The bullet whizzed past Cole's head and buried itself in the wall behind him. Cole returned fire, the heavy slug tearing a chunk out of the doorframe near Durbin's head. Forcing the banker to duck back into the lobby, the world devolved into a chaotic hell of noise and smoke and flying splinters of wood. The night watchman, woken by the shots, began shouting from the front of the bank. Peters, clutching a wounded arm, was trying to reload, cursing in a steady, venomous stream. Through it all, Mara's mind was surprisingly clear. She was crouched behind the desk, the ledger clutched in her arms. She saw the lantern, which the first man had dropped when Cole fired. It had rolled against the wall, its flame still burning, spilling a pool of kerosene onto the floorboards. She saw her chance. It was a desperate, insane gamble. but it was the only one they had. While Cole laid down covering fire, forcing Peters and Durbin to stay back, Mara scrambled on her hands and knees toward the lantern. "Mara, no," Cole yelled, seeing what she was about to do. She ignored him. She grabbed the lantern by its hot metal handle. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, she rose up and hurled it with all her might into the lobby. It shattered against the far wall, near a stack of papers and old records. The spilled kerosene ignited with a sudden, explosive whoosh. A wall of brilliant orange flame erupted, instantly consuming the dry paper and licking its way up the wooden teller's cage. The effect was instantaneous. Peters and the watchman cried out in alarm, stumbling back from the heat and the smoke. For a precious few seconds, their attention was entirely on the fire. Now Cole yelled. He grabbed Mara's hand and pulled her toward the window. Smoke was already filling the office, thick and choking. The roar of the fire was now louder than the storm outside. They scrambled through the window, tumbling back out into the cold, cleansing rain of the alley. They didn't look back. They ran, hand in hand, through the mud and the downpour, the hellish orange glow of the burning bank lighting up the night sky behind them. They reached the horses, untied them with frantic, fumbling fingers, and swung into the saddles. As they spurred the terrified animals out of the alley and into the storm-swept darkness, Mara risked one last glance over her shoulder. The Redemption Savings and Loan was crowned in a wreath of angry fire, its flames reaching defiantly into the black, rain-swept sky, a funeral pyre for a kingdom of secrets. And clutched under her arm, soaked with rain and smelling of smoke, was the book that had started it all. They had won. But as she felt a sharp, burning sting in her side, she knew the war was far from over. The ride away from the burning bank was a blind, desperate flight into the maelstrom. The storm, which had been their shield, now became their tormentor. Rain lashed down, so thick and cold it felt like a physical assault, and the wind tore at them with savage, invisible claws. They didn't speak. There was no breath for words, only for the ragged, desperate act of survival. Cole led the way, his head bowed, navigating the treacherous, mud-slicked terrain by some instinct born of a lifetime spent under this sky. Mara followed, clutching the precious, rain-soaked ledger under her slicker with one hand and the saddle horn with the other. The initial, fiery triumph of their escape was quickly being extinguished by the cold, brutal reality of their situation. They were fugitives, wounded, with the most powerful man in the territory and his entire network of corrupt lawmen hunting them. Sometime before dawn, as the storm began to exhaust itself, Cole turned off the main track and guided them into a narrow, rock-strewn canyon. It was a place that did not appear on any map, a jagged scar in the earth he had discovered years ago. They dismounted, their bodies screaming with exhaustion, their horses trembling and lathered with sweat. At the back of the canyon, hidden behind a thick screen of ancient, gnarled junipers, was a small line cabin, little more than a one-room shack built by some long-forgotten prospector. It was crude, but it was shelter. Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled of dust and pack rats, while Cole saw to the horses, finding them a small, sheltered overhang. Mara collapsed onto a rickety wooden cot. Now that the adrenaline had faded, the pain in her side, a sharp, burning sting she had barely noticed during the escape, blossomed into a full-throated agony. She pulled back the wet layers of her clothing and saw the dark, ugly tear in her chemise, already crusted with blood. Durbin's bullet had grazed her, carving a shallow but painful furrow along her ribs. When Cole returned, his face grim in the faint pre-dawn light filtering through the cabin's single dirty window, he saw her huddled on the cot, her hand pressed to her side. He said nothing. He simply went to the small, rusted stove, and with a practiced economy of motion, used the dry kindling he kept stashed there to coax a small, precious flame to life. He put a pot of water on to boil and then came to her with the same basin and clean cloths as before. This time, when he tended to her wound, She did not flinch. His touch was no longer that of a stranger. It was the familiar, careful touch of an ally, of the only person in the world she could trust. As he cleaned the gunpowder residue and blood from the wound, his hands were steady, his expression unreadable, but she could feel a quiet, simmering anger radiating from him, an anger that was entirely on her behalf. This wound, unlike the ones on her back, was a shared injury. It was a price they had both paid in the first battle of a war they had chosen to fight together. He bandaged her side tightly with another strip of clean linen. "It's not deep," he said, his voice a low rumble, "but it'll need watching." For 3 weeks, the tiny cabin became their entire world. It was a time of enforced stillness, of waiting and listening. The first few days were the worst. Every sound, the cry of an eagle, the scuttling of a lizard on the rocks outside, sent a jolt of fear through Mara. She expected to see the faces of Peters and his men appear at the door at any moment, but Cole remained calm, a reassuring anchor of solidity in her sea of anxiety. He knew the canyon. He knew it was defensible. He had chosen their hiding place well. On the second day, a lone rider approached the canyon mouth. Mara's heart leaped into her throat, but Cole calmed her with a steady hand on her shoulder. "It's all right," he said. "He's a friend." The man was a freight driver named Elias, a grizzled old-timer with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He was one of the few men Cole trusted from his past, a man who owed Cole his life from a misunderstanding with a band of Apaches years ago. Cole explained the situation in clipped, concise sentences. He didn't show Elias the ledger. Instead, he carefully tore out a single page, the page with Abigail Delaney's name on it. The page that documented the fraudulent debt and the cold, cruel notation, leverage. "Take this to Denver," Cole instructed, handing the folded page and a hastily scribbled letter to the freight driver. "Give it to U.S. Marshal Thompson. Tell him the rest of the book is safe. Tell him Silas Durbin has been running this territory like his own personal kingdom. And the proof is here. Tell him there's been a fire and a gunfight. He'll understand." Elias took the page, his expression grim. "Thompson's a good man, but he's a careful one. It might take time." "We have time," Cole said, though both men knew it was a commodity they were running desperately short of. And then the waiting began in earnest. The days bled into one another, marked only by the sun's slow transit across the narrow strip of sky visible from the canyon floor. They lived on the sparse supplies Cole had packed and the small game he was able to trap nearby. The confinement was a crucible, forcing them into a strange, quiet intimacy. The vast, empty spaces in their conversation began to fill. She learned about Eleanor. He spoke of his sister in a low, halting voice one evening as they sat by the fire, the ledger lying on the small table between them like a holy text. He told her not of how she died, but of how she had lived of her laughter, her fierce loyalty, of the blue ribbon she had always worn in her hair. And, in the telling, Mara understood the true source of his quiet, protective fury. He was not just saving her. He was finally, after 30 years, fighting for the ghost of his sister. In turn, he learned about Mara, not the victim, but the woman. He learned of her sharp mind as they pored over the ledger together, her finger tracing the lines of crooked numbers, her voice low and steady as she unraveled Durbin's complex web of deceit. She was no longer just a girl he was protecting. She had become his partner, his strategist. She possessed a core of resilience that he had not seen in anyone, save perhaps his own mother. Then, after 23 days of suffocating silence, Elias returned. He rode into the canyon not with urgency, but with a slow, deliberate pace. He had a wide, satisfied grin on his face. "Thompson sends his regards," he said, swinging down from his horse. He and a half-dozen of his best deputies rode into Redemption this morning. The news arrived in a flood, a second-hand account of the day the world had turned upside down. The U.S. Marshals had not come as a timid inquiry. They had arrived like a thunderclap on a clear day. 6 men, hard-faced and weary from the long ride, their dust-covered coats doing little to conceal the authority of the law they carried on their hips. They rode down the center of the main street, their eyes missing nothing, their presence a cold, foreign object in the town's corrupt ecosystem. Their first stop, Elias recounted, was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller, a man whose spine had been purchased by Durban years ago, had blustered and threatened, puffing out his chest and demanding to know their jurisdiction. The lead marshal, a tall, raw-boned man named Thompson, had simply produced a federal warrant and, without another word, disarmed the sheriff and placed him in his own jail cell. The move was so swift, so devoid of emotion. It left the townspeople who witnessed it speechless. The local law had been decapitated in less than 5 minutes. Their second stop was the bank, or what was left of it. The fire had gutted the building, leaving behind a blackened stone shell open to the sky. Silas Durban was there, overseeing a crew of men clearing the debris, his expression a mask of public grief and private fury. When the marshals approached, Durban had turned on them with the full force of his arrogance. He had demanded to know who they were, what they wanted, who had sent them. He had spoken of lawsuits, of powerful friends in the territorial capital. Marshal Thompson had let him finish. Then he had simply said, "Silas Durban, you're under arrest for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder." The effect, Elias said with a grin, was spectacular. The blood drained from Durban's face. For the first time in his life, the most powerful man in the county was speechless. He looked around for his men, for Peters, for Calloway, but they were already being rounded up by the other deputies, their revolvers taken, their hands bound. Durban, the king in his castle, suddenly found himself a king with no guards, no army, and no castle. The town had watched in stunned, disbelieving silence as Silas Durban, the man who held their mortgages, their secrets, and their fears in the palm of his hand, was led in handcuffs down the main street and locked in the cell next to his sheriff. And then the silence had broken. It started as a trickle. An old woman, Mrs. Gable, whose husband had died of a broken heart after Durban had foreclosed on their small ranch, walked into the sheriff's office and began to speak. She told the marshals her story, her voice quavering but clear. Then came a farmer, a man named Henderson, who told them how his water rights had been stolen through a forged document held at the bank. He was followed by a shopkeeper, then a blacksmith, then another rancher. It became a flood. The fear that had held redemption in a stranglehold for a decade was broken. The silence that Durban had cultivated through intimidation and ruin was shattered by a chorus of voices, each one adding another layer to the story of his crimes. People who had scurried past each other on the street with their eyes downcast were now standing in small groups, talking, sharing stories they had kept locked away for years. A great heavy blanket of oppression had been lifted, and the town of Redemption was taking its first shaky breath of free air. Cole and Mara listened to Elias's story, a profound quiet settling over the small cabin. The battle was over. The war, it seemed, was won. But there was no triumph in their faces. No elation. Only a deep, bone-weary sense of relief. The monster had been caged. Justice, a thing they had almost ceased to believe in, had finally found its way to their small, forgotten corner of the world. The return to redemption was a surreal, disquieting affair. They did not ride in as conquering heroes, but slipped back into town under the cover of a gray, overcast morning. 2 weary ghosts returning to the world of the living. The town itself felt different, as if a great weight had been lifted from its shoulders. People moved with a new lightness. Their voices, when they spoke to one another in the street, were a few notes higher. The hunched, fearful posture that had been the town's uniform, now replaced by straight backs and lifted chins. Marshal Thompson met them at the edge of town, a tall, somber man whose quiet authority seemed to emanate from him like heat from a stove. He looked from Cole to Mara, his gaze taking in their worn-out clothes, the exhaustion etched on their faces, and the raw, healing wound on Mara's side, which she could not entirely conceal. He didn't ask for details of their ordeal. He simply nodded, a gesture of profound, professional respect. "It's over," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "The federal magistrate will be here in a month. Durbin and his men will be transported to Denver for trial. They won't be coming back." He handed Mara a thick, legal-looking envelope. "The bank's assets have been frozen, its books seized. We found the fraudulent deed to your mother's house, the original. True deed has been restored. The house is yours, free and clear. There's also a writ from the territorial court, a preliminary compensation, taken from Durbin's personal accounts, for damages." He paused. "For everything." Mara took the envelope, her fingers numb. She looked from the marshal's grimly satisfied face to Cole's unreadable one. It felt unreal. A piece of paper to erase a nightmare. A handful of money to pay for a world of pain. She wanted to feel joy, or relief, or triumph. Instead, all she felt was a vast, hollow emptiness. Cole did not stay. He saw Mara safely to the small, familiar house at the end of the street, the house where she had been born. Its front door was still splintered from where Peters had kicked it in, and a dark, ugly scorch mark marred the wall where the lamp had caught the curtains. But it was hers. Cole resaddled his horse, his movements stiff and weary. "You'll be safe now," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Because of you," she whispered, her voice thick. He simply touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that was both a farewell and an acknowledgement of a debt he would never allow her to name. And then he was gone, a solitary figure riding back toward the empty plains, back to the silence he had always called home. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet, painful reconstruction. Mara cleaned the house, scrubbing away the memories of that terrible night. She patched the scorched wall, replaced the broken door, and slowly, piece by piece, began to reclaim her life, the people of redemption. Once a community of silent, fearful strangers, now treated her with a strange mixture of awe and gentle pity. They would stop her on the street, their hats in their hands, and thank her in low, humbled voices. They brought her food, a fresh-baked pie, a string of fish, a sack of potatoes, small offerings of gratitude and, perhaps, of apology for their own long years of silence. She was a hero to them, a symbol of their newfound freedom. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the ghosts came, she felt only like a survivor, a girl who had been lucky enough to run faster than the wolves. The compensation from the court was more than she had ever imagined. It was a small fortune, enough to ensure she would never be beholden to any man again. Along with the house, she discovered that her mother, in her quiet, stubborn way, had also managed to acquire the small, barren plot of land adjacent to their property. It was nothing but a quarter-acre of dust and rock, but it was hers. Her inheritance was complete, a home, a piece of land, and a future she had never dared to dream of. Meanwhile, back on the ranch, Cole Thatcher found that the silence he had once craved had become an oppressive, suffocating thing. The quiet of his cabin was no longer peaceful. It was empty. He would sit at his table, drinking his morning coffee, and see the ghost of her sitting on the stool by the fire. He would walk to the corral and remember the feel of her small, fragile weight in his arms. He had pushed the world away for 30 years, and in 3 weeks, she had broken down all his walls. And now, she was gone, and the silence she had left behind was a ringing, echoing void. He tried to lose himself in his work, in the familiar, punishing rhythms of the ranch. He broke a wild, stubborn stallion, a task that demanded every ounce of his strength and focus. But even as he worked the horse, his mind was elsewhere. He was fighting a different battle, a quieter but no less difficult one, against a loneliness he had not allowed himself to feel in decades. He had told her he was tired of hiding, but now, back in his fortress of solitude. He realized he didn't know how to do anything else. 1 month to the day after he had left her at her door, he found himself saddling his horse, his hands moving with a purpose that seemed to come from somewhere outside himself. He didn't know what he was going to say. He didn't know what he was looking for. He only knew that the silence on his ranch was more than he could bear. He rode toward redemption, his hat pulled low, a man as adrift as any tumbleweed. He found her not in the house, but on the empty plot of land beside it. She was standing in the middle of the barren ground, her back to him, staring at the distant mesas as the late afternoon sun began its slow descent. She wore a simple, clean dress, and her hair, now clean and brushed, shone like polished copper in the golden light. The wounds on her back had healed into thin, silvery scars, but he knew there were other, deeper wounds that no salve could touch. He dismounted by the fence and walked toward her, his boots crunching on the dry, gravelly soil. He stopped a few feet away, holding his hat in his hands, feeling as awkward and out of place as a boy at his first dance. She must have heard him approach, but she didn't turn around immediately. She just stood there, a still, solitary figure against the vast, empty landscape. "Cole," she said finally, her voice quiet but clear. She turned to face him. Her face was thinner than he remembered, and there were new, knowing shadows in her eyes. But she was no longer the haunted, terrified girl he had found by his fence line. A quiet strength radiated from her, the hard-won strength of someone who has walked through fire and come out the other side. "Mara," he said, his own voice sounding rusty to his ears, I came to see how you were." "I'm well," she replied, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "The house is clean. The town is safe. Marshal Thompson says I'll have to go to Denver to testify at the trial." "I'll take you," he said, the words coming out before he had even thought them. Her smile deepened slightly. "I know you will." They stood in a comfortable, familiar silence for a long moment. The silence of two people who had no need for unnecessary words. His gaze swept over the empty plot of land where they stood. It was marked at the corners by 4 simple wooden stakes. It was nothing but dirt. "What will you do with it?" he asked, gesturing to the ground with his hat. "Sell it, build a bigger house." She shook her head, her gaze turning back toward the horizon. "No, I'm not going to sell it." She took a deep breath, the dry, sage-scented air filling her lungs. "My mother..." She scrubbed her fingers to the bone so that I could learn to read, so that I could have a life that wasn't defined by a wash tub and a needle. This land, it's a part of that. It's a beginning. She looked down at the dusty earth at her feet, then back up at him, her eyes shining with a sudden, fierce intensity that took his breath away. "For weeks, in that cabin with you, all I could think about was surviving, just making it to the next sunrise. But now..." She gestured to the empty space around them, to the quiet town, to the vast, open sky. "Now, that's not enough. I don't just want to survive anymore. Cole, I want to live. I want to build something. Something that matters." The words hung in the still, golden air between them. They were simple words, but they held the weight of a lifetime of pain and a future of infinite possibility. He heard in them an echo of his own desolate heart, a longing for a purpose beyond the simple, solitary act of existence. He had spent his life surviving the ghosts of his past. He had never considered that there might be a way to actually live with them, or even to lay them to rest. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and he no longer saw the victim he had rescued or the ally he had fought beside. He saw a woman of impossible strength, a woman who was standing on a patch of barren ground and seeing not what was, but what could be. And in her vision, he saw a flicker of hope for himself. He didn't speak. He simply stepped forward and stood beside her, his shoulder almost touching hers. He put his hat back on his head and followed her gaze out to where the sun was beginning to set, painting the clouds in shades of fire and rose. They stood together, 2 solitary figures on a piece of empty land, surrounded by the ghosts of what had been, and silently, together, they began to imagine what could be. The trial in Denver was a formal, sterile affair, a world of polished wood and black robes that felt a million miles away from the dust and blood of redemption. Mara stood in the witness box, not as a victim, but as a chronicler. Her voice, clear and steady, did not tremble. She did not speak of her fear or her pain. She simply presented the facts, walking the court through the pages of the green leather ledger, her finger tracing the lines of Durbin's spidery script. She explained the false entries, the extortionate interest rates, the coded notations that corresponded to acts of violence and intimidation. She was not just telling her own story. She was giving voice to the dozens of names in that book, the silent, forgotten victims of Durbin's long reign. Cole sat in the back of the courtroom for every moment of her testimony. He did not move, did not speak. He was just a quiet, solid presence, a mountain of a man in a borrowed suit that looked 2 sizes too small for him. He was her anchor, his unwavering gaze a silent reminder that she was not alone. When Silas Durbin was finally sentenced, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage, Cole was the one who met Mara at the courthouse steps and simply said, "It's time to go home." Home. The word had a new meaning. It was no longer just a place of shelter, but a place of possibility. The journey back was different from the one that had taken them to Denver. The silence was not tense, but companionable. The landscape, which had once seemed so hostile, now looked beautiful in its rugged, uncompromising honesty. When they returned, they found a town in the awkward, uncertain process of waking from a long nightmare. The fear of Durbin was gone, but in its place was a vacuum. The town had been defined by its oppressor for so long, it had forgotten how to define itself. People were free, but they were adrift. That was when Mara took the envelope of compensation money, the writ from the court, and the deed to her barren plot of land, and she called a town meeting. They gathered in the livery stable, the only building large enough to hold them all. They were a collection of wary, weathered faces, ranchers, farmers, shopkeepers, and their wives. They looked at Mara, this young woman they had once pitied and ignored, with a mixture of respect and uncertainty. She did not stand on a platform. She stood on the same dusty floor as everyone else, her hands clasped in front of her. "I know what you're all thinking," she began, her voice ringing with a quiet confidence that surprised them all. "You're thinking that this is blood money, that it's the price of what happened to me, to my mother, to so many of you." She looked around the room, meeting their eyes one by one. "And you're right, it is, but it can be more than that. It can be a beginning. Mr. Durbin, he built his bank on our debt. He built his power on our fear. He took from us, and he left us with nothing but the dust. I say we take what he left, and we build something new, something for ourselves." She unrolled a piece of butcher paper on which she had drawn a crude but clear sketch. "On my land, the empty plot by my house, we're going to build a school." A murmur went through the crowd. A school. They hadn't had a proper school in years, just a part-time teacher in a dusty back room of the church. "Our children deserve more than we had," Mara continued, her voice rising with passion. "They deserve to read, to write, to understand numbers. They deserve a future that isn't tied to the price of cattle or the whims of a banker. This money," she held up the envelope, "will buy the lumber. It will pay for the books and the teacher, but it will be our hands that build it. All of us. Together." She paused, then pointed to another part of her drawing. "And next to it, we'll build a clinic, a small one, just one room, but a clean place, with proper supplies, where Dr. Adams doesn't have to set a broken bone on a saloon table." It was a radical, audacious vision. It was a declaration that they were no longer victims, but architects. For a long moment, the crowd was silent, digesting the sheer improbability of it all. Then, from the back of the room, a calloused hand went up. It was Henderson, the farmer whose water rights had been stolen. "My boy can't read his own name," he said, his voice thick with a shame he had carried for years. "I've got a strong back and I can swing a hammer. I'm in." That broke the dam. One by one, others began to speak up. The blacksmith offered his forge for the ironwork. The women offered to organize meals for the workers. The owner of the mercantile offered to sell them the nails and glass at cost. It was a fragile, hesitant beginning. But it was a beginning. A town that had been united only by a common fear was now finding a new, more powerful unity in a common hope. Cole, who had stood silently at the back of the stable, slipped away before anyone could ask him his thoughts. But the next morning, as the first group of men gathered with their tools at Mara's plot, a wagon arrived, pulled by two of Cole's strongest draft horses. It was loaded high with perfectly cut, seasoned pine logs from a grove deep on his land. Cole was at the reins. He didn't say a word. He simply unhitched the wagon, tipped his hat to Mara, and began to unload the timber. His action spoke louder than any pledge. And so, the rebuilding of redemption began. The sound of saws and hammers filled the air from sunup to sundown, a joyful noise that drowned out the ghosts of the past. It was slow, difficult work. There were disagreements, setbacks, moments when it seemed the sheer scale of the task would defeat them. But through it all, Mara was the constant, unwavering center. She was there every day, not as a foreman, but as a partner. She learned to measure boards, to mix mortar, to drive a nail straight and true. She worked alongside the men, her hands growing calloused, her face browned by the sun. And every week, like clockwork, Cole would ride into town. He would arrive on a Saturday morning, his horse laden with supplies, sometimes more timber, sometimes a side of venison, sometimes just a sack of fresh coffee. He would work all day, his quiet strength and practical know-how proving invaluable. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a steadying force. Then, as the sun began to set, he and Mara would sit together on a stack of lumber, sharing a mug of coffee, and look at the skeleton of the building rising from the dust. In those quiet moments, a new, unspoken language grew between them, a language of shared purpose and deep, abiding respect. The solitude of his ranch and the bustle of her town were two different worlds, but they were the bridge that connected them. By the time the first snows of winter dusted the tops of the mesas, the schoolhouse was finished. It was a simple, sturdy building, filled with the clean, sharp scent of new pine. It had large windows that let in the bright desert light, and a real slate blackboard at the front. The day it opened, the entire town turned out. They watched as 23 children, some of them nearly grown, walked through the door for the first time, their faces filled with a shy, wondering excitement. Mara stood on the steps, her heart so full she thought it might break. She looked out over the crowd and saw Cole, leaning against the fence line, his hat in his hands, a small, rare smile on his face. He had not built this. She had not built this. They had built this. The town of Redemption was forever changed. It was not a perfect place. The scars of Durban's reign were still there, in the memories of the old and the caution in their eyes. But now, those scars were overlaid with a new story, a story of resilience and community. It became a story told to newcomers, a legend passed down to children. They still talked about the night the bank burned, about the fire that had cleansed the town of its rot. And at the center of that story was always the woman who had walked out of the darkness, a book of secrets in her arms, and had shown them how to build a future out of the ashes of the past. And what about you? If you were Cole Thatcher, would you have dared to raise a gun at your own gate, just to protect someone the whole town had turned its back on? Perhaps the answer lies in your own heart, as you sit with your coffee at the end of the day, watching the sunset burnish the west red. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to see where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let us know. It's always amazing to see how far these tales of the Old West travel. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to help even more, Hit that hype button to help this story be heard by more people. Your support means the world to us.